December 1941. Brooklyn Navy Yard. Howard Zinn is 19 years old, an apprentice shipfitter. His first day on the job.
Howard Zinn, the historian?
The historian. But right now, he's just a kid walking through the gate for the first time. Here's how he described it decades later in an oral history interview.
Okay.
The first time I walked out on the ways, I was walking into a kind of nightmare of sounds, noise, and smells.
A nightmare.
The smells of working on a ship are amazing smells. The smells of the welding, especially when they were welding galvanized steel. Galvanized steel is covered with zinc, and when it burns, it gives off the worst smell in the world.
And that's just the welding.
On the summer, it was very, very hot because we were wearing protective clothes. They gave us salt pills in the summertime because we were sweating and sweating.
Salt pills?
And we were sweating not only because of the heat, but also because a lot of our job required us to crawl into the hull into these little compartments that were 4 by 4 by 4.
4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet.
Which had a little hole through which you could go into this 4 by 4 by 4 compartment to work. That's where they built ships. That's where they built the fleet that won the war. And that's where 1.7 million Americans breathed in dust that wouldn't kill them for 20 years or more.
This is Asbestos, a conspiracy 4,500 years in the making, episode 26, The Shipyards Never Sleep.
After Pearl Harbor, American shipyards didn't sleep. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
For how long?
For the duration. At Brooklyn Navy Yard alone, 70,000 people reporting to work each day at peak production. The yard was a city unto itself.
3 shifts, so workers coming in at...
Day shift starting at 6 or 7 a.m., swing shift at 2 or 3 p.m., graveyard starting at 10 or 11 at night.
And the insulation work, the asbestos work.
Happening around the clock. A day shift worker might enter a compartment that had been filled with asbestos dust by the night shift, by the swing shift before it. The dust didn't clock out.
And overtime?
Bureau of Labor Statistics records show that by 1942, 40% of Brooklyn Navy Yard workers were logging more than 48 hours a week. President Roosevelt extended working hours for war registries in February 1943.
More hours, more exposure.
More hours, more exposure. And the time-weighted averages that industrial hygienists would later use to calculate safe exposure, meaningless, because the workers were in it for 60, 70 hours a week.
This episode is brought to you by Danziger and Diano, because every diagnosis deserves a team who's been through it. Dandel.com.
Let's talk about who was actually handling the asbestos and what they were handling. First, the pipe coverers, the insulators, the workers applying asbestos directly to pipes, boilers, and turbines.
The highest exposure.
The highest exposure. At shipyards like Bath Iron Works in Maine, there were dedicated pipe covering shops. Dr. Philip Drinker, a Harvard professor, chief health consultant to the Navy, surveyed them in 1944. His finding? Workers cutting and pounding asbestos matting in conditions that created, quote, a very real asbestos hazard.
What were they cutting?
Felt insulation. Asbestos content? 85 to 95%.
That's not insulation with asbestos. That's asbestos with insulation.
Exactly. And in some shipyards, Brooklyn, for example, there were asbestos mixing rooms. Workers combining raw asbestos fibers with magnesia, mixing them by hand.
By hand?
Then there were the boilermakers. They weren't applying insulation directly, but they were working in the confined spaces where insulators had just been, or where insulators were working alongside them. Court testimony describes it. In the naval shipyards, workers of all trades in small compartments breathed the heavy asbestos dust created by insulators and boilermakers.
Heavy asbestos dust in small compartments.
Now add the welders.
How were welders exposed? They weren't handling insulation.
They were wearing it. Asbestos welding gloves, asbestos aprons, asbestos leggings, asbestos blankets used as fire shields. And more than that, welders worked in the same confined spaces as insulators. They welded near freshly applied insulation.
So the protective gear was asbestos and the environment was asbestos.
And then the electricians. Asbestos wire insulation and asbestos electrical tape. The carpenters cutting asbestos cement panels, transite board. The machinists brake and clutch materials, gaskets. The reality, documented in court records, asbestos was essentially everywhere.
How much asbestos are we actually talking about on a ship?
An Iowa-class battleship, 465 long tons of thermal insulation.
465 tons.
A destroyer, 85,000 to 90,000 pounds of thermal insulation alone, not counting pipe hanger liners, gaskets, electrical cables. And how many ships were built? The Maritime Commission program built over 5,500 vessels between 1939 and 1945. Liberty ships, 2,710. Victory ships, 531. Each one packed with asbestos, each one built by workers who would carry the fibers home in their lungs.
So that's the exposure.
Now, let's look at what officials were writing during the same years in the same shipyards.
You covered some of this last episode, the Stevenson memo, commander warning the Surgeon General that we are not protecting the men as we should.
March 1941, before Pearl Harbor. But it didn't stop. 1944, Dr. Drinker reports to the Navy Bureau of Medicine that dust counts at Bath Iron Works were very much higher than anyone would recommend.
And the Navy's response to that?
A 1944 letter from the Navy Bureau of Medicine to the supervisor of shipbuilding. The Bureau had conducted dust counts during application of amosite felt insulation. Their finding, quote, concentrations well above the accepted maximum of 8 million particles per cubic foot.
What was the actual accepted maximum?
The U.S. Public Health Service had established a threshold of 5 million particles per cubic foot back in 1938. The Navy used 8 million as their maximum. The shipboard measurements were well above that.
And what was their conclusion?
1944, while 1.7 million workers were laboring in those conditions.
If someone in your family worked as a pipe fitter, boiler maker, or electrician, the exposure records exist. Danziger and Dayano has spent 3 decades finding documentation companies claimed was lost. Dandel.com.
So that's what the Navy knew, what Drinker documented, what the Bureau of Medicine wrote in internal correspondence. Now, let's talk about what the workers knew.
They knew the dust was there, obviously. They could not know. You couldn't see across the rooms.
They knew it was there. They didn't know what it was doing to them. Clarence Burrell, industrial insulation worker, 33 years, 1936 to 1969, shipyards and refineries along the Texas-Louisiana border. His deposition testimony, given under oath in the lawsuit that would change asbestos law forever, describes what he believed about the dust.
Okay.
I'm sure as you just move them just a little and there's dust. And I blowed this dust out of my nostrils by handfuls at the end of the day.
By handfuls of dust out of his nostrils. What a visual.
I tried to use water, too. I even used mentholatum in my nostrils to keep some of the dust from going down in my throat. But it is impossible to get rid of all of it.
So he knew he was breathing it every day.
Every day, for 33 years. And here's what he believed about what it was doing to him. He thought the dust was bad. He thought it was bothersome. But, and this is his sworn testimony, he never realized it could cause any serious or terminal illness.
He didn't know it could kill him.
He didn't know it could kill him. And here's the part that broke me. When asked what he thought happened to the dust once he breathed it in, Burrell said he believed it dissolves as it hits your lungs.
He thought it dissolved.
He thought it dissolved, like sugar in water, like it just went away. That's what the workers believed. The dust that was coating their lungs, embedding in their tissue, starting the 20-year clock towards mesothelioma. They thought it dissolved.
Nobody told them otherwise?
Burrell's testimony is explicit on this point. No one, not employers, not manufacturers, not the Navy, ever told him asbestos dust could cause fatal disease. He learned about asbestosis in January 1969, when he was hospitalized with breathing problems. February 1970, they removed his right lung and found mesothelioma. He died June 3, 1970, 4 months after learning what the dust had actually done.
33 years of exposure. 4 months of knowing the truth.
And Burrell wasn't unique. He was typical. The New York Times would later report that during World War II, asbestos dust clouded shipyards so thickly that one often could not see across the rooms they worked in. 1.7 million workers. And they thought the dust dissolved.
That's what they walked into every day for years.
Let's put the timelines side by side. 1930, Merriweather and Price establish in the British medical literature that asbestos causes asbestosis. 1935, Sumner Simpson writes that the less said about asbestos, the better off we are. 1938, U.S. Public Health Service establishes 5 million particles per cubic foot as the safe limit. 1939, Navy Medical Officer H.E. Jenkins recommends respirators for shipyard workers. 1941, Navy Commander Stephenson warns Admiral McIntyre that we are not protecting the men we should. 1943, Navy issues safety standards calling for ventilation, respirators, medical exams. 1944, Navy Bureau of Medicine documents shipboard dust concentrations as a dangerous hazard to personnel.
That's the official record.
And during the same years, 1941 to 1945, 1.7 million workers labor in conditions so dusty they can't see across rooms. They blow asbestos out of their nostrils by handfuls. They wear protective gear made of asbestos. They crawl into 4x4x4 compartments filled with asbestos. And they think it dissolves.
How is that possible? The Navy knew. The standards existed.
The information never reached the workers. Navy medical officers documented hazards in internal memos. The memos went up the chain of command. The workers on the shipyard floor saw nothing.
So when workers started dying 20 years later,
the executives who signed the memos would be retired or dead. The workers would be grandfathers wondering why they couldn't breathe, and the paper trail would be buried in corporate archives.
The latency clock.
20 to 50 years between exposure and diagnosis. The workers exposed in 1943 wouldn't develop disease until 1963 at the earliest. Today, 30% of all mesothelioma diagnoses are veterans, nearly 1,000 shipyard and Navy cases diagnosed every year.
The shipyards built the fleet that won the war.
And they poisoned a generation.
Which is why this matters. Larry Gates grew up 3 blocks from the Shell refinery in Pasadena, Texas.
The Golden Triangle.
His father was a chemical operator, instrument technician, worked at Shell for years, exposed to asbestos throughout the plant.
In his 20s and 30s, when the exposure was heaviest.
And then?
1999, his father was diagnosed with mesothelioma, dead 6 months later. Larry's words, "I watched him wither away from a strong, active man into a skeleton."
And now, Larry is senior client advocate at Danziger and Diano, helping families navigate VA claims and trust fund compensation.
He's 72, currently fighting his own battle with cancer.
When he talks to families, he's not reading from a script. He's lived both sides, as a son who lost his father and as someone fighting the same disease. Dandel.com. That's DANDELL.com.
That's the men's story. The pipe coverers, the boiler makers, the welders, the electricians. 1.7 million workers at peak production, every one of them walking into the dust every day for hours on end. But they weren't the only ones exposed.
No, they weren't. Because starting in 1942, there was another workforce flooding into the shipyards. Women.
Rosie the Riveter.
By 1943, women made up 13% of shipyard production workers, 30,000 in Portland alone, 7,000 at Brooklyn Navy Yard. They did the same jobs, they worked in the same conditions. And when the war ended and they went home,
their husbands kept working, bringing the dust home on their clothes.
Next episode, the women of the shipyards, the exposure that happened on the factory floor and the exposure that happened at the wash basin.
Until next time, this has been Asbestos, a conspiracy 4,500 years in the making. Howard Zinn. He once wrote, "There is no flag large enough to cover the shame of killing innocent people."
Apprentice shipfitter, Brooklyn Navy Yard, 1941.
Goes on to write A People's History of the United States, one of the most influential historians of the 20th century.
And Matt Damon's next-door neighbor.
In Newton, Massachusetts. Damon was 5 when Zinn was writing the book.
That's why Will Hunting tells Robin Williams to read it. It'll knock you on your ass.
Damon wrote that line himself.
And Zinn survived. The shipyards, I mean.
He survived. Not everyone did.
4 by 4 by 4.
That detail, crawling through a hole into a compartment the size of a closet.
Filled with asbestos dust from the shift before.
And the shift before that.
The Burrell testimony, though.
Blowed this dust out of my nostrils by handfuls.
Handfuls. And he thought it dissolved.
Like sugar in water.
33 years of exposure. 4 months of knowing.
That's the part that stays with me. He didn't find out until 1969.
While the Navy had documented it as a dangerous hazard in 1944.
25 years earlier.
The information gap.
That's what a conspiracy looks like. Not a meeting in a dark room, just memos that don't go down, standards that don't get enforced.
465 tons per battleship.
85,000 pounds per destroyer.
And 5,500 ships.
Each one packed with it. Each one built by workers who had no idea.
Next week, the women.
Rosie the Riveter. And the exposure nobody talks about.
The wash basin.
Shaking out their husband's clothes, their father's clothes. The dust that came home.
And on that note, I'm going home. Need a ride?
Yeah, I've had a few drinks.
It is just a
What's new?
Let me just keep it going because I'm a team